During the grim year of 1940, the island nation situated in the southern Pacific Ocean found itself in a position of extraordinary vulnerability, stripped of conventional military resources including ground forces, armaments, and armored vehicles. The expanding Japanese Empire was moving with terrifying momentum across the Pacific theater, and the possibility of hostile forces landing on New Zealand shores appeared to be merely a question of timing rather than likelihood. During this moment of national crisis, an unconventional farmer-turned-political figure named Robert Semple conceived what many considered an audaciously foolish proposition: welding sheets of corrugated metal typically used for agricultural buildings onto heavy-duty farm tractors, thereby transforming civilian machinery into improvised armored fighting vehicles. Military specialists ridiculed the concept. Journalists wrote scathing commentary, yet Bob proceeded with unwavering determination. What emerged from this endeavor earned the dubious distinction of being labeled the most inadequate armored vehicle ever conceived in warfare history. However, beneath the apparent absurdity existed a calculated logic that few observers comprehended at the time. Understanding why the seemingly preposterous machine might have rescued an entire population from overwhelming despair requires exploring the full story. Until its conclusion, Robert Semple entered the world in October of 1873 at Crudine Creek within the Goldfield regions of New South Wales, Australia. Born to Irish immigrant parents who labored in agricultural dairy operations, throughout his formative years, young Bob developed a reputation founded upon two distinctive characteristics: remarkable muscular power and an instinctive facility with mechanical apparatus. Before reaching 16 years of age, he had already mastered the repair of intricate farming machinery that confounded seasoned technicians. Beyond his mechanical aptitude, Bob possessed a profound awareness of social justice issues and an exceptional talent for mobilizing working-class populations. Throughout the 1890s, as agricultural laborers throughout New Zealand endured exploitation by affluent estate proprietors, Bob initiated the organization of labor unions. This represented perilous undertaking, as landowners frequently employed violent enforcers to intimidate union activists. Bob remained undaunted by such threats. Standing over 6 feet 3 inches in height and possessing the physical strength of a draft animal, he could protect himself through force if circumstances demanded. Yet his most formidable asset was his rhetorical ability. He articulated the concerns of common laborers authentically because he belonged to their ranks, comprehending their hardships through direct personal experience. In 1908, at age 35, Bob secured election to the New Zealand Parliament representing the Labour Party. This constituted a remarkable ascent for someone lacking formal academic credentials, who had commenced his working life as a farm laborer. Throughout the subsequent 3 decades, Bob would establish himself as a consequential figure within New Zealand's political landscape. When the Labour Party finally assumed governmental power in 1935, following extended years in opposition, Bob Semple received appointment as Minister of Public Works. This position ideally matched someone possessing his background and expertise, encompassing responsibility for infrastructure development, construction projects, and industrial advancement. Bob supervised ambitious undertakings including roadway systems, bridge construction, and hydroelectric power installations. Yet one escalating concern consistently disturbed his rest: the question of national security. New Zealand during the 1930s represented an extraordinarily exposed nation. Its demographic count stood at merely 1.6 million inhabitants dispersed across two geographically isolated islands, situated in the South Pacific. The Army maintained minimal numbers with inadequate equipment. The Air Force existed almost entirely on paper, and naval capabilities consisted of several obsolete vessels. During the First World War, New Zealand deployed 100,000 soldiers to European battlefields, representing the highest per capita mobilization proportion among all allied nations. However, regarding modern military hardware, the nation possessed virtually nothing. Bob grasped the harsh reality of geographical isolation. New Zealand lay 2,000 kilometers distant from Australia and 10,000 kilometers from Great Britain. Should invasion forces arrive, the nation would remain alone for months before reinforcements could possibly reach them. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, initiating the Second World War, Bob's anxieties intensified dramatically. Although initial hostilities concentrated upon the European continent, Bob detected ominous patterns emerging elsewhere. Japan had already launched its invasion of China during 1937, and the Japanese Empire demonstrated increasingly expansionist, militaristic, and aggressive characteristics. The year 1940 witnessed the situation deteriorating catastrophically. France collapsed in June, leaving Great Britain isolated against Nazi Germany. Throughout the Pacific region, Japan began directing its attention southward toward resource-rich territories in Indonesia, Malaysia, and potentially both Australia and New Zealand. Bob Semple, now aged 67, confronted what appeared an impossible predicament. As Minister of Public Works, he bore responsibility for industrial production capabilities during wartime. However, New Zealand possessed no established arms manufacturing industry whatsoever. The nation lacked factories capable of producing tanks, aircraft, or heavy artillery pieces. Military equipment required importation from Great Britain, which was desperately manufacturing for its own survival needs. New Zealand orders faced constant postponement, cancellation, or complete disregard. Bob required a solution that proved rapid, economically feasible, and achievable utilizing locally available resources. This sparked the idea that would ensure his name endured throughout history, though not in the manner he anticipated. If importing tanks proved impossible, they would manufacture their own. They would accomplish this utilizing what New Zealand possessed in abundance: agricultural tractors, and farmers' resolute determination. To comprehend Bob Semple's actions, one must understand the atmosphere of absolute terror gripping New Zealand during 1940 and 1941. The Japanese represented neither a distant theoretical adversary nor an abstract possibility. They constituted a genuine and imminent danger. During September 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, and by July 1941, they occupied remaining Indochinese territories. Each aggressive move brought them incrementally closer to the South Pacific. British and American intelligence agencies warned that Japanese attack constituted a question of timing rather than possibility. New Zealand remained painfully unprepared for such an eventuality. The New Zealand Army, designated the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, was engaged in combat operations throughout North Africa and Greece. These soldiers demonstrated exceptional fighting qualities, yet they remained 20,000 kilometers distant from their homeland. Should Japan launch an invasion, they could not defend their native soil. Domestic defense consisted of territorial forces, reserves, home guard units, civilian volunteers, and a handful of regular military personnel. Equipment levels proved disgraceful, with many volunteers training using wooden implements painted to simulate rifles. Because insufficient genuine weapons existed, heavy artillery was virtually non-existent, and tanks were completely absent. Literally zero armored vehicles existed across the entire New Zealand territory. The civilian population experienced pervasive fear. Newspapers published cartographic illustrations demonstrating how readily Japan could reach New Zealand. Families residing in coastal communities constructed improvised protective shelters. Evacuation protocols were drafted and distributed. Children rehearsed air raid procedures at educational institutions. The government mandated nightly blackout conditions with windows covered, street illumination extinguished, and automobiles operating without headlights. The concern was that Japanese bomber aircraft might utilize city lights as navigational references. Bob Semple received daily correspondence from desperate citizens inquiring what governmental measures were being implemented to safeguard them. He possessed no reassuring responses to provide. The defense budget was stretched to its absolute limits. New Zealand represented a small and relatively impoverished nation economically. Manufacturing modern weaponry from nothing proved financially impossible, and time was rapidly depleting. Within this context of desperation, Bob experienced his conceptual breakthrough. He was observing a farm in Canterbury where Caterpillar D8 tractors operated. When inspiration struck him, tractors possessed mobility, powerful engines, and tracked systems capable of traversing challenging terrain. Why not convert them into armored vehicles? Critics would dismiss this as ridiculous, thinking tractors were slow, unprotected, and never engineered for combat applications. Yet Bob perceived matters differently. He recognized available resources that could be transformed into something superior to possessing nothing whatsoever. He presented the concept to the War Cabinet, where reactions proved mixed. Some ministers considered it pragmatic thinking, while others found it embarrassing. New Zealand would become an international object of ridicule if it attempted confronting Japanese tanks with armored tractors. However, Bob possessed a compelling argument. What alternative exists? Should the nation wait passively while Japanese forces land upon their shores, or fight utilizing whatever resources they possess? No experimental project. He assembled a team comprising engineers, welders, and mechanics, many being public works employees he had previously employed on infrastructure projects. They were all practical individuals who understood working with metal, machinery, and improvisation. The selected location was railway workshops in Wellington, the nation's capital. There existed industrial equipment including lathes, drills, welding apparatus, and a skilled workforce. The project received classification as urgent and received priority status. Workers operated in continuous 24-hour shifts. The objective was creating a functional prototype within weeks rather than months. Bob Semple, a 67-year-old government minister, frequently appeared personally at the workshops, offering suggestions, encouraging workers, and occasionally wielding a welding torch himself to demonstrate technique. The Bob Semple tank was about to materialize, and soon the world would express its derision. The Bob Semple tank was constructed upon a Caterpillar D8 tractor foundation, a robust agricultural machine utilized for heavy-duty operations on farms and construction sites, featuring a 110-horsepower diesel engine and reliable tracked locomotion system. The D8 represented a workhorse of New Zealand industry. However, transforming an agricultural tractor into a combat vehicle required considerable imagination and substantial welding work. Bob's design proved surprisingly ambitious. He didn't merely want to armor an existing tractor, but create a functional combat vehicle with multiple weapon positions. The superstructure was constructed using corrugated metal sheets, a common material used for rural roofing and shed construction in New Zealand. It wasn't high-grade military armor steel, but literally roofing material, yet it was what remained available. Corrugated sheets were cut, bent, and welded to create an angled enclosure round the tractor. The design appeared peculiar, resembling improvised rural construction more than military hardware. However, logic existed in this approach. The corrugated metal, though thin, offered greater structural strength than flat sheet metal of equivalent thickness. Due to the corrugation pattern, Bob and his engineers hoped it could deflect or absorb impacts from rifle bullets, if not heavy machine gun fire. The crew compartment was designed to accommodate 8 men, an extraordinarily high number for an armored vehicle. The layout positioned the driver forward, commander above, and 6 gunners in positions around the superstructure. The armament consisted of 6 .303 caliber Bren machine guns, SDA and DARD British weapons that New Zealand possessed in limited stock. Each gunner operated a Bren through an opening in the armor. The concept was that the tank could unleash significant fire volume in multiple directions simultaneously. Provisions also existed for anti-aircraft machine guns mounted atop, in case Japanese aircraft attacked. However, the design harbored obvious problems that became immediately apparent during construction. First, weight. Adding a metal framework and 8 crew members to the D8 tractor drastically increased weight. The 110-horsepower engine suitable for agricultural work became overloaded. Maximum speed dropped to approximately 15 kilometers per hour on level terrain, even slower on uneven ground. Second, height. To accommodate 8 men and multiple weapon positions, the superstructure rose over 3.5 meters. This made the tank an enormous target, easily visible. Any principles of camouflage or low profile were completely disregarded. Third, visibility. The driver possessed only narrow slits to see through the armor. Driving proved extremely difficult, especially on rough terrain or during combat when visibility would be further restricted by smoke and confusion. Fourth, protection. Improvised ballistic tests revealed that corrugated metal could stop rifle bullets at extended distances, but was vulnerable to heavy machine gun fire and completely ineffective against any artillery or anti-tank gun. Fifth, ergonomics. The interior was cramped, uncomfortable, and extremely hot. During New Zealand summer, internal temperature could exceed 50 degrees Celsius. Ventilation was inadequate, and the crew would exhaust quickly. Yet Bob persisted. The first prototype was completed in December 1940. When it rolled from the workshop, reactions proved mixed. Some workers applauded they had built something from scratch within weeks. Military officers present were more skeptical, with one colonel reportedly commenting it certainly looked impressive in a way. The press was invited to a public demonstration where journalists watched as the Bob Semple tank crossed the railroad yard, its 8 crew members firing Brens at training targets. Next day's headlines were mixed. Some newspapers applauded the ingenuity, while others were less charitable. One particularly scathing headline read Semple's tin tank. However, Bob ignored the critics. He ordered production of additional units with the goal of building dozens of these tanks. To equip territorial defense units, the Bob Semple tank was officially in production and was about to become legendary. For all the wrong reasons, while Bob Semple oversaw production of his tanks, the international military community began taking notice, and the reaction was brutal. British military attaches in Wellington sent reports to London describing the project, with replies being polite but firm, innovative but unsuitable for modern combat. Translation: it was a joke. American military analysts were more direct, with a 1941 intelligence report calling the Bob Semple tank an improvised, agricultural construction with no real military value. However, the most scathing criticism came from New Zealand tank veterans serving in North Africa who fought in real British tanks against the German Afrika Korps. When they heard about Bob's project, their reaction was disbelief followed by anger. Technical criticisms were numerous and devastating. Inadequate armor, pathetic speed, huge profile, overcrowding, lack of radio communication, weak armament, complex maintenance, and terrible mobility. The risk of tipping over was real. Comparisons with contemporary tanks were humiliating. Cruel nicknames proliferated, including Semple's mobile shed, cardboard tank, and corrugated iron disgrace. A New Zealand satirical magazine published a cartoon showing Bob Semple tank being destroyed by an angry cow with the caption, "Finally meets a worthy opponent." Yet there was one detail that critics completely missed. Bob Semple never expected these tanks to engage German panzers or even Japanese medium tanks. He had a completely different purpose in mind, and for that specific purpose, however ridiculous it might seem, Bob's Semple tank made perfect sense. Bob Semple wasn't an idiot. He understood perfectly well that his tanks were inferior to real military weaponry. However, critics didn't understand New Zealand's unique strategic context. The New Zealand defense plan in 1940 to 1941 was not to fight tank battles against the invading Japanese army. That was impossible. Japan had hundreds of actual tanks, experienced crews, and massive air support. The defense strategy was different: to make the invasion so costly that the Japanese would choose easier targets. Bob envisioned a specific scenario where Japanese forces attempted an amphibious landing on New Zealand beaches, the most vulnerable and likely point of attack. In this scenario, Bob Semple tanks would have a specific role: mobile fortifications to defend beach positions. Japanese infantry disembarking from invasion barges would face heavy machine gun fire, with 6 brands firing simultaneously, unleashing approximately 3,000 rounds per minute against infantry in open terrain. That would be devastating. Corrugated metal, though inadequate against cannons, could protect crews from rifle and light machine gun fire that assault infantry would initially carry. Enemy tanks would come later, but initial waves would be infantry vulnerable. Slow speed didn't matter because tanks would be in prepared defensive positions, not chasing enemies or performing offensive maneuvers. They would essentially be bunkers that could slowly reposition themselves if necessary. Most importantly, the psychological effect cannot be dismissed. Even a bad tank is intimidating to infantry without adequate anti-tank support. The sound of the engine, the appearance of the armored vehicle, machine guns firing, all of this would impact the morale of attackers. And there was a brutal economic factor: cost. An American Sherman tank cost approximately $50,000 in 1942, equivalent to $850,000 today. A Bob Semple tank cost approximately 800 New Zealand pounds, about $3,200 US, or $55,000 adjusted for inflation today. For the cost of one Sherman, New Zealand could build 15 to 16 Bob Semple tanks and build them locally using domestic resources without relying on imports that could be intercepted by submarines. Production time also favored Bob. A Sherman took months to build in an American factory, then weeks to transport to the South Pacific. Bob Semple could be built in 2 to 3 weeks in Wellington. In total war, when resources are limited and time is critical, a good enough available now often trumps perfect that arrives too late. Bob also planned mass production with the goal of 200 plus tanks to equip multiple territorial defense units along both islands. Any invading force would face defense in depth, even if each individual position was weak. The concept wasn't original. Soviets used inadequate light tanks in massive numbers during the initial German invasion precisely because they were available when better tanks weren't, and Finns converted civilian vehicles into improvised armored vehicles. During the Winter War with the Soviet Union, Bob Semple was applying the same principle born from desperation and necessity. Employ whatever resources are at your disposal, for possessing something inadequate surpasses possessing nothing whatsoever. Yet a critical vulnerability existed within the entire strategic approach. The plan's effectiveness depended entirely upon the Japanese invasion actually materializing on New Zealand shores. What would occur if hostile forces never arrived? The Bob Semple armored vehicle would face judgment not based upon its practical utility in defensive scenarios, but rather upon how absurd it appeared when compared against genuine military tanks. History would demonstrate little kindness in its assessment. Throughout the period spanning December 1940 until approximately mid-1942, roughly 34 Bob Semple armored vehicles were fully constructed, with several additional units existing in various stages of assembly. The precise quantity remains contested among historical scholars because production documentation was incomplete and poorly maintained. What historians unanimously agree upon is that manufacturing proved slow, fraught with complications, and ultimately terminated prematurely. Difficulties emerged immediately from the project's inception. Caterpillar D8 tractors represented precious industrial assets desperately needed for critical infrastructure development, including airfield construction, defensive fortification building, and military roadway projects. Converting these D8 tractors into armored vehicles meant removing them from these essential civilian and military functions. A bureaucratic conflict arose between the Public Works Department under Bob Semple's leadership and the Defense Department. Military officials argued persuasively that D8 tractors delivered superior value as construction equipment to fortify defensive positions, rather than serving as improvised tanks of questionable military value. Bob fought tenaciously to maintain the project's viability, but political pressures were mounting steadily against him. Other cabinet ministers began publicly questioning the allocation of scarce resources to this unconventional endeavor. Within Parliament, opposition members attacked Bob's armored vehicle as a white elephant and an unconscionable waste of public funds during wartime. The press became increasingly critical with each passing month. An editorial published in the Wellington Evening Post during March 1941 argued passionately that while New Zealand soldiers in North Africa fought with genuine equipment against Rommel's Afrika Korps, the government was squandering resources on mechanical fantasies. However, a more significant development was unfolding that would fundamentally alter the strategic calculati. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. Suddenly, pressure on Great Britain eased somewhat as Hitler's military focus shifted eastward. The British government began sending more military equipment to Commonwealth nations, including New Zealand. In December 1941, everything changed dramatically. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war, and crucially, Americans began constructing a massive military presence throughout the Pacific theater. For New Zealand, this meant they were no longer geographically isolated and strategically vulnerable. The American Navy patrolled the oceans surrounding their islands. American aviation established bases on New Zealand territory, and eventually American military equipment, including actual combat tanks, would begin flowing southward. The desperate necessity that had originally motivated Bob's armored vehicle project was evaporating rapidly. The project was quietly canceled during mid-1942 without fanfare or official announcement. What became of the armored vehicles that were actually constructed? Historical records are frustratingly vague, but apparently the first prototype unit was used for field training exercises near Wellington. Crews practiced beach defense tactics and coordination drills before it was eventually decommissioned and likely scrapped for metal. Units 2 and 3 were designated for territorial defense units, but rarely operated in any meaningful capacity. Maintenance proved problematic, and with no genuine threat materializing to justify their deployment, they sat largely unused. Incomplete units were disassembled with components recycled into other wartime applications. The valuable D8 tractors were stripped of their corrugated metal armor and returned to civil construction service, where they could provide genuine value. Not a single Bob Semple tank ever discharged a weapon shot in hostile action. None witnessed combat operations. None survived to the present day as a museum artifact or historical display piece. For numerous critics, this confirmed their initial assessment that the vehicles had been a complete waste. From the beginning, however, some Home Guard veterans who trained with these machines saw matters quite differently. Sergeant Thomas Wilson, who participated in training exercises with the Bob Semple tank during 1941, recalled in a 1985 interview that everyone laughed at the contraption, naturally, but possessing something, even something ridiculous, proved superior to possessing nothing whatsoever. It provided soldiers with a sense that they could mount meaningful resistance, that they weren't completely defenseless against invasion. That psychological factor mattered tremendously for military morale during dark days. Another veteran, Corporal James Mackenzie, reflected that they understood it wasn't a genuine tank by any military standard, but it was concrete and tangible evidence that someone in government was attempting to protect them. In 1941, when invasion appeared imminent and inevitable, that symbolic gesture meant something profound. There was also a more practical perspective offered by Commander John Harrison, who noted that training on Bob Semple vehicles taught crews valuable lessons in coordination, communication under stress, and teamwork in confined spaces. When they eventually received actual tanks, that foundational training was not entirely wasted. Within the broader historical context, Bob Semple's tank became an international joke, and Bob Semple himself became a target of persistent ridicule. Bob Semple refused to allow the tank project to define the remainder of his distinguished career, but the shadow lingered uncomfortably. Every time he spoke in Parliament about defense issues, opposition members inevitably made jokes about Semple's farm tanks. However, Bob was a seasoned politician who had endured far worse during his union organizing days. He absorbed criticism stoically and continued working as Minister of Public Works throughout the war years. He oversaw massive infrastructure projects that actually contributed significantly to the Allied war effort. Airfields built under Bob's supervision enabled Allied air operations throughout the South Pacific. Military roads facilitated rapid troop movement. Port facilities allowed for efficient landing of American equipment and supplies. These contributions were significant and genuinely valuable, but they weren't dramatic or visually memorable like bizarre armored tractors. The media naturally focused on spectacular failures rather than mundane successes. In 1943, Bob Semple resigned his position as Minister of Public Works due to declining health problems. He was 70 years old, and decades of hard physical and political work were exacting their toll. He remained in Parliament until 1944, after which he retired from politics completely. Bob's final years were peaceful and quiet. He lived in Wellington, occasionally granting interviews about his political years. When journalists asked about the tanks, he remained defensive but expressed no regrets whatsoever. "We did what we thought was necessary with the resources available to us," he consistently stated. Critics enjoy the luxury of hindsight, while we only had the urgency of the moment. In 1952, an interviewer asked directly if he considered the tank project a mistake. Bob replied thoughtfully that a mistake consists of not attempting anything when action is required. They tried their best, and it didn't work as they expected. But in 1940, doing nothing would have been criminal. He added with a wry smile that at least it provided employment for welders during difficult economic times, so it wasn't completely useless. Bob Semple died on September 20th, 1955, at the age of 82. Obituaries focused primarily on his long career in the labor movement, his contributions to workers' rights, and his infrastructure projects. The tank was mentioned briefly, usually with a tone of historical curiosity. Some obituaries were kind, others less so, but none captured the full context of why he did what he did during those desperate days. Decades passed quietly, and Bob Semple's tank disappeared from New Zealand's public consciousness. It occasionally appeared in military history books, as a footnote about bizarre wartime improvisations. Then during the internet age, something extraordinary and unexpected happened. Throughout the 2000s, Bob Semple's tank was rediscovered by online communities fascinated by obscure military technology. Military history forums, and eventually internet memes transformed the tank into a cult celebrity. The Bob Semple tank has become an ironic symbol of making the best of whatever resources you possess. Military strategy video games have started including it as an Easter egg or commemorative vehicle. YouTubers have created videos analyzing its design with affectionate humor. A Reddit user summed up this sentiment perfectly, describing Bob's armored vehicle as embodying the spirit of every person who has ever attempted to fix something with duct tape and hope gloriously terrible and terribly glorious. New Zealand has embraced this absurd legacy wholeheartedly. A scale model of the Bob Semple tank has been displayed at the Auckland War Memorial Museum, not as an example of military brilliance, but as a testament to Kiwi determination and ingenuity when facing adversity. New Zealand documentaries about World War II now include segments about the tank, usually with a tone of affectionate pride. Yes, we built the worst tank in the world, but we built something when we possessed nothing. Bob Semple, the man, has also been fundamentally re-evaluated by modern historians. Contemporary scholars point out that he was pragmatic, doing the absolute best he could manage with an impossible situation. In 1940, with Japan advancing and no external military aid available, doing nothing was simply not a viable option. Professor Richard Anderson, a military historian at Victoria University in Wellington, argues persuasively that the Bob Semple tank should be judged not by military engineering standards, but by the context of desperation in which it was created. In that context, it wasn't entirely irrational. There exists also the argument that the project possessed psychological and political value that transcended any military effectiveness considerations. It demonstrated that the government was taking action, that New Zealand was not a passive victim awaiting its fate, and that Kiwis would fight with whatever resources they had available. Historical precedent existed for such thinking. During the London Blitz, the British constructed fake wooden anti-aircraft guns to create the appearance of stronger defenses than actually existed. The goal was not genuinely shooting down German aircraft, but boosting civilian morale and potentially confusing enemy aerial reconnaissance. Bob Semple's tank operated on identical logic, a symbol of resistance even if its substance remained questionable. The Bob Semple tank was not the only example of desperate, improvised armored vehicles during World War II. When we examine the broader international context, we observe that multiple nations facing similar emergencies made similarly unorthodox choices. The Soviet Union produced the Ni-1, nicknamed Na Ispug, meaning for the fright. During the initial panic of the German invasion in 1941, the Soviets converted STZ-5 agricultural tractors into makeshift tanks called Ni-1. They were strikingly similar to Bob Semple's design, with thin sheet metal armor, machine gun armament, and slow speed. The crucial difference was that Ni-1 vehicles saw genuine combat during the siege of Odessa and the defense of Stalingrad. These improvised tanks were utilized in desperate attacks against German positions and were decimated by German artillery, but they played a role in critical moments when real tanks were unavailable. The Soviets built approximately 100 Ni-1 vehicles, and none survived the war. Unlike Bob Semple's vehicles, they proved a concept that a bad tank was better than no tank when the alternative was total defeat. Finland produced the OT-130 and OT-131 during the Winter War against the Soviet Union. In 1939 to 1940, Finns converted agricultural tractors into armored vehicles, using any available armor, even welding bank vault doors as frontal protection. The Finns called these vehicles ersatz tanks, meaning replacement tanks. They were as inadequate as Bob Semple's design, but the Finns had no alternative. With an army of 300,000 facing a Soviet force of 1 million, every resource had to be utilized. These ersatz tanks were used primarily for morale support and armored transport duties, but they symbolized Finnish determination to fight against impossible odds. That determination eventually forced the Soviets to negotiate peace. Australia produced the LP-1, nicknamed Frog, as New Zealand's closest ally, also built an improvised tank. In 1942, when Japanese invasion of Australia seemed imminent, an Australian designer constructed the LP-1 based on a tractor chassis with homemade armor and machine gun armament. It was essentially the Australian version of Bob Semple. Only one prototype was built, and testing showed it was unsuitable for combat, leading to project cancellation. However, the existence of LP-1 proves that Bob Semple was not alone in his thinking. Facing the identical Japanese threat with the same limited resources, the Australians arrived at the same solution independently. The common pattern emerges clearly. All of these projects shared similar characteristics, including creation during emergencies, when adequate equipment was unavailable, use of chassis from civilian vehicles, usually tractors or trucks, improvised body armor made from locally available materials, weaponry limited to machine guns, criticism by military experts as inadequate, and defense by creators as better than nothing. Bob Semple's tank was not a unique aberration, but rather an example of the universal human response to emergency situations, doing something, anything, with the resources available. The difference was that Bob Semple became internationally famous, while other improvised tanks were forgotten because the nations that built them had bigger war stories to tell. New Zealand, being relatively safe after 1942, had the luxury of reflecting on its defense preparations, including its peculiar tank. And so Bob Semple's tank went down in history not as one among many desperate improvisations, but as the desperate improvisation that everyone remembers. So what enduring lessons can we extract from the story of Bob Semple's armored vehicle? Is it merely a humorous anecdote about a ridiculous military project? Or do deeper lessons exist? Context is everything judged by German or American military engineering standards. The Bob Semple tank is a joke, but judged by the context of isolated New Zealand in 1940 with zero resources, an imminent invasion, it makes desperate sense. Imperfect action overcomes perfect inaction. Bob Semple could have waited for real tanks from Britain or America, which eventually arrived, but in 1940, eventually could mean too late. He chose to act with imperfect resources rather than passively wait for a perfect solution. That might never come. Morale and psychology matter profoundly. The military value of Bob Semple's tank was questionable, but its psychological value demonstrating that the government was trying to protect citizens, that resistance was possible, that New Zealand was not a helpless victim, was genuine and meaningful. Failure is not a sin. Bob Semple's tank failed in its objectives, but trying and failing is fundamentally different from not trying. Bob Semple made a calculated gamble that didn't work, but that doesn't make him an idiot. It makes him human facing an impossible problem. Small nations face impossible choices that major powers with massive industries never confront. Bob Semple's tank seems ridiculous to superpowers, but small nations don't have the luxury of infinite resources. The modern legacy demonstrates that Bob Semple's tank has become part of New Zealand's cultural identity. It represents the Kiwi spirit, practical, improvisational, determined, and comfortable, looking ridiculous if necessary. New Zealand is a small nation that has historically needed to innovate to compete globally. From rugby teams to the film industry, Kiwis have developed a reputation for doing a lot with a little. Bob Semple's tank is a spiritual ancestor of this tradition, not because it worked, but because it exemplifies a willingness to try. There is also growing recognition of Bob Semple's larger contributions beyond the tank. His work on infrastructure during the war was genuinely significant. Hydroelectric projects he initiated provided power for post-war industrialization. Roads he built still exist and serve New Zealand today. The tank was a failure, but the man was not. The farmer-turned-politician who became a minister may not have built a great tank, but he built something more lasting, a story that continues to inspire people. 80 years later, demonstrating human courage and determination when facing impossibility. And perhaps in the end, that represents victory itself.